Good day, everyone. We're about to get started, so if you could take a seat, please. Really excited to hear this next talk. It's going to be very interesting. Andrew Brandt, who is principal researcher at Sophos, is going to talk Fake News Incorporated. So take it away, Andrew.
Thank you. So I'm Andrew Brandt. I'm principal researcher at Sophos. Wanted to tell you a little bit about my background because I think that's relevant to this talk. And the term fake news is a very loaded term. Has a lot of political connotations, and especially in our current climate, it can be very controversial. But I am a former journalist who then switched gears and came into the security industry after nearly 20 years of working as a reporter and photographer for some small newspapers and then large print publications. I worked for these school papers when I was in college. I also worked for Fodor's Travel Publishing, and I spent almost a decade at PC World, which is a consumer tech publication that unfortunately in about 2009 ceased publication, so it doesn't exist anymore, but it still exists online. After I left PC World, I switched gears and jumped into the malware analysis field. I always loved playing with computers, and I did it as a hobby. And what drove me into security was that I did a story for PC World the last year that I worked there that was called Spyware Following the Money Trail. And it was a story involving using packet capture tools and installing the browser toolbars that were doing pop-up ads onto computers and then observing the redirection that led from affiliate to affiliate to affiliate to eventually advertisers. And as a result of that story running, some pretty major advertisers like Best Buy and Dell cut their ties with a lot of advertising affiliate networks, and it kind of changed the advertising industry, and it really it was a good feeling to feel like I had made an impact on a problem that had been plaguing people for a number of years, but also that it told me that I actually feel like I can do this. And so I jumped over and I was hired at a company called WebRoot in 2006 and worked there as a malware researcher for a number of years. And then after a while had met a fellow by the name of Joe Levy, who had been the CTO of SonicWall, and he was starting a small startup that was a network forensics tool company. And that company is called Solera Networks, and they were, soon after I joined the company, purchased by Blue Coat, and then that Blue Coat was purchased by Symantec, so I ended up essentially working for all three of those companies over a period of time. I left Symantec earlier this year and joined Sophos. And now I do all of those things. I run a malware research lab, I do network forensics, and I worked on some of these CTA related research like VPN filter and the SamSam report that we published, and work on that for Sophos Labs, as well as publishing their blog called Sophos Labs Uncut. So a little bit of the background, because it's a security industry audience, and so I'm pretty sure that there aren't very many people here who are journalism colleagues of mine, but basically there's certain things that all journalism outlet needs. They need their reporters and editors, obviously, but they also need their business side and their production side. So there's the ad sales people, and in journalism there is this essentially what they call it is, they literally call it the firewall between editorial and business. And so usually the ad sales and publisher side of things do not interact with the editorial side of things. At least that is the optimal situation. Production staff are just basically the people who make sure that the words get onto paper or in pixels. And then of course we need readers. We need people who will read the stories, and we need to provide them with a content that they're going to that's going to bring them back to a journalism outlet over and over again. The rule that most journalism school professors will teach people is basically J-School 101 is that all news is local, meaning that whenever there is a story, then you are covering that story. If you work for the Podunk Daily Press, there has to be a Podunk Whereverville angle to the story, at least in the headline, if not just throughout the story. And so that is key, and that is one of the characteristics that I am discovering is sort of notable about the sites that I'm about to talk about. So just as an example of a real news site, I wanted to point out this one. So it's local from Colorado, which is where I live. It's Colorado Springs Gazette. Colorado Springs is a city of about 300,000 to 400,000 people. It includes the U.S. Air Force Academy and the and Colorado State University, as well as Cheyenne Mountain Complex and the giant Peterson Air Force Base, covers that region. And as you can see from here, that all of the headlines on this front page of the Gazette from the last 24 hours are about how these things that are of national importance have some kind of local connection, right? And this is what I mean when I say all news is local. Even a story about Russian hackers has a Colorado Springs angle, which is why it ended up above the fold on the front page. Another characteristic of real news sites and real newspapers is something called the masthead. The masthead is essentially the organizational structure of the publication, and it is usually published on the second or third page of the newspaper, and there is always a page on the website that has the names and contact information for all the reporters, as well as the editorial staff, the opinion piece authors, as well as advertisers and other business-related emails. But it's basically the contact information for everybody at the organization. And the masthead in print is actually regulated by law, not by law, but by an industry organization that requires publications to have a masthead and have certain information about their publication printed in every edition. So one of the cool things about this, the Gazette, is that they're a medium-sized journalism outfit, and they've recently bought a bunch of smaller town newspapers that are in the sort of local region, and one of those is this one called the Tri-Lakes Tribune. So Tri-Lakes is a region of up in the mountains, sort of west of Colorado Springs, that includes a lot of small towns, and they bought these papers recently and sort of added them into their portfolio of news organizations. So they have a website called TriLakesTribune.com, and this newspaper has existed for a long time. It was only just recently sort of been bought, and it's part of the ongoing conglomeration of news organizations in the industry, where they're getting smaller outlets are being bought by bigger ones to sort of increase their coverage and presence, and the smaller outlets are essentially allowing themselves to be bought because otherwise they're going out of business. It's very hard for them to stay in business. So this is just a story from earlier last month about how they just relaunched the website, TriLakesTribune.com. And just like all these other papers, they have local coverage in terms of this town called Monument, which is really kind of a small town up in the mountains near ski resorts. And then, of course, there's a masthead with the names of the reporters, and you can see that there's some of the reporters have their email addresses, Gazette.com, and some of them is PikesPeaksNewspapers.com, which is they're both the parent organizations, but they're still in the process of merging these two groups. So the original ownership of Tri-Lakes Tribune was from this company called Colorado Community Media, and this is the who is information for the website for this newspaper from last year, and they had registered a bunch of domains, including with and without the hyphenation and .com, .org, .net, and so this is one that was registered and was still active until sometime last year and owned by this Colorado newspaper group. And when the Colorado newspaper group sold it, or when Colorado Community Media sold it to the Gazette, that was when they kind of let the registration on this domain lapse. And what happened was that you can see here at the beginning of this year, over about a 3-week period, first the domain just lapsed into availability for someone to register, and then at the end of January, this character who, again, we can't trust whether the who is information is correct, but this person who says their name is Nick Dimov in Odessa, Ukraine, had registered the Tri-Lakes Tribune web domain. And yeah, you're wondering, like, why would someone in Ukraine register a domain that had been used for a newspaper in the United States, in a small one-horse mountain town? And the reality is that they wanted to start their own newspaper, except that they posed posited that the existence of this newspaper is that it is an organization based in a town called Van, West Virginia. And as you can see, they produce, it's actually still live, like this website, it does, exist today. This was a screenshot from yesterday, and you can see that there's, coverage of the First Lady on her trip. And there's this interesting story that I found that the headline is, Trump says Saudi king wouldn't last 2 weeks without United States support. And I called attention to that because I'm going to mention that particular headline in a minute. It's interesting. But what you do notice when you see this is that there is no of relevance in any of these headlines to the town of Van, West Virginia, a town that I had never heard of before. Another thing that's notable is the fact that the address information that's on this contact page on the website says an address, and it says Van WV, and then underneath it, it says West Virginia again, comma, and the zip code. And then, of course, it gives a telephone number and just one email address for editor at and the small paper. Now, it's not unusual for very small newspapers to just have a single email address, but it is unusual for a newspaper that was based in Colorado and is now purported to come from West Virginia to have an area code and telephone number from Utah. This is the town of Van, West Virginia. It has about 9 streets and a population of around 200 people. One of the facts that's really interesting about it is that it's not even a town. It's called a census-designated place. So it is not even an incorporated town with a city council or a police department. It literally is a post office, a school, and a bunch of houses in the middle of the mountains in West Virginia. What are some of these inconsistencies? Well, I've mentioned it. There is no Tri-Lakes region in West Virginia. It just doesn't exist. Why would there be a magazine or a newspaper called the Tri-Lakes Tribune in a place where there is no Tri-Lakes? The street that's said on its address doesn't exist in this town that has 7 streets in it. The area code is wrong and the phone number doesn't work. Okay, I guess I'm not buying any advertising. Oh, I guess that maybe explains why there is no advertising whatsoever, not one banner ad on any page of that newspaper. So thanks to some of my friends at Symantec who were willing to share some information with me. They were able to look into some of their reputation history for this particular domain. And this is a tool that they use that's called Billiard Room. I used to use this tool when I was working there. And what it does is it kind of it correlates IP addresses, domain names, the whois address of the registrant, and other information. What's interesting is when we look at this Tri-Lakes Tribune, you can see it's been hosted at a few different IP addresses. This is over a long span of time. So some of these IP addresses where this website was hosted correspond to several years ago when it was part of Colorado Community News, and some of it, or the address that's at the very bottom there, is the IP address where it is hosted today, which is this 88858924 address. Looking at the other domains that are hosted on that IP address, you can see that there are a few other news-like websites that are, if you just look at the domain names, right, there's this Newburgh Gazette, which I've called attention to, but there's also the Santé News, there's the Strand Gazette Info, there's the Village News Online, Western Reboot. There's a bunch of other domains that are sort of part of this, that had at one point been hosted on this IP address that all have kind of a newsy name to their domain. And the one that I wanted to sort of talk about next is this Newburgh Gazette, which is what I've called out here. So this is the front page of the Newburgh Gazette, and its masthead says that it's served Newburgh, Illinois since 1928, so very similar to what we saw with the Colorado Springs Gazette, except the Colorado Springs Gazette actually exists. And this is, as you can see, it's actually a screenshot from yesterday from the front page of this newspaper. And the newspaper has stories about Brett Kavanaugh. It has stories about Canadian dairy farmers. It has a story about Tottenham Hotspur versus Barcelona, so European football, very popular in small town Illinois, obviously. And if you'll notice in the most popular list there on the right, the third one down, it says, Trump says Saudi king wouldn't last 2 weeks without USA support. Well, that's an interesting coincidence that they have exactly the same headline. Some other interesting things about the Newburgh Gazette is that, and now I have done this research over the course of 18 months. And so some of these screenshots are fairly old, including these two, which is where I just did some searching for the Newburgh Gazette and references to it in social media. And as you can see, that there was at one point quite a lot of Facebook activity where people were linking to stories on the Newburgh Gazette, including this website that's just called World N News Today is what it was called. And in addition to these websites, there was also lots of stuff on Twitter that was posted and linking back to these guys. They have a contact information page, and sort of just like the Tri-Lakes Tribune, this Newburgh Gazette is, has its address on there. And if you look it up, you can see that it's in a town called Buffalo Grove. Now, as it turns out, a few years ago, when I was a reporter for PC World, they sent me on assignment out to meet some people to do a privacy checkup story. And one of the people that I met with was in the town of Buffalo Grove, and it was just a coincidence to see that this small suburb of Chicago was referenced on this news site. So I thought that was kind of interesting. What was more interesting, though, was the fact that there is no town called Newburgh, Illinois. The closest name of a town is something called Newburgh Township. And Newburgh Township, much like Van, West Virginia, is a very small town. It's basically population under 100. Under 1,000, and has about 500 house units. It says it contained 428 housing units in 2010. Maybe by now they've built a few more. This is a Google map that shows you the distance and the route that you might take if you were going to drive from Newburgh Township, Illinois to Buffalo Grove. So if you were a local news reporter for a tiny little newspaper in this tiny town of 1,000 people, a 300-mile drive to work every day just doesn't seem like a really great way to get the kind of coverage that you think you would need for such a small community. And it is distinctive because, once again, we have a situation where there is no Newburgh, Illinois, that there is no street in Buffalo Grove that is the street address where the newspaper claims to come from. The phone number's disconnected, and there's this 300-mile gap between the two towns. Something is smelling very wrong here. So looking at Billiard Room again and talking about this Newburgh Gazette. So now this was never a real website. It was never a legitimate news outlet, and it has been hosted at 2 different IPs. Now it shows on the left here that it was hosted on that 8885 IP, and for a period of time it also shared an IP 149.56.190.10, which happens to be hosted right here in Montreal by OVH, a big internet service provider. The little ball that's sort of off to the right there that says 362 is an indication from the Symantec reputation service that at some point in the past and over the history of their reputation service, that 362 unique domains had been DNS'd to that IP. And when we look at that, it's very interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about this Newburgh stuff first before we jump into that IP. So it has private whois. So unlike Nick Dimov from Odessa, Ukraine, we don't know who really owns this domain. As I mentioned, it was hosted on these 2 IP addresses at one time or another. And when we look at what else was hosted on 149.56, this is just a slice of a gigantic list of almost 400 domains. And if you just look at the list, you'll see that there's a lot of news sites on this domain, or hosted on this IP. So there's Spaceflight Insider Info, and Lung Disease News Web, and Tax Justice Blog, and USA Daily Stocks. But as well, there's like Stock News Gazette, Strand Gazette Info, American Daily News 24, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, going down the rabbit hole. This has been, for me, a kind of a mission. So I started doing this while I was still working at Symantec. And the further I looked, and the more of these domains that I individually looked at, they kept leading me further and further down this rabbit hole and leading to more and more of these websites that are just like the Newburgh Gazette and the Tri-Valley newspaper. And there are just hundreds of them on this one IP address. But when you look at each one individually and you start to correlate, well, this one was hosted on this other IP, and what else is hosted on this IP, and there's another 400 here. And you start looking at all the 400 that are on that one, and many of them are hosted on 2 or 3 IP addresses elsewhere. And those also contain many more news sites that no one's ever heard of and that contain fictitious contact information and basically forged information. And it's really not even all in the United States. They're sharing the same CMS templates. They're sharing the same sort of goofy address glitches in the way that they present their contact information. And most of them, in fact, I am going to stay right here, right now, all of them never existed and do not actually exist in the places that they purport to cover. So some of these characteristics of these domain names that they share across these thousands and thousands of domains that have eventually led to is that they either have a name of a place, which I think you saw that there's place names, but then there's also like an industry or a topic that is their purported focus of coverage, like financial or health or tech. And then there's a lot of other names that get thrown in there, like 24 or Tribune or Press. And so you might get the Health Observer Tribune 24.com or the Tech Weekly Reporter.net. And they pick a permutation of these hundreds of different real words to create fictitious domain names and repeatedly produce these websites. And so this slide here I just wanted to mention. So before GDPR came into effect, some of these domains were not registered with private whois, and they had like the Nick Dimov guy, if that's his real name, used a distinctive, unique email address for his whois information. And I was able to use an account at Domain Tools to set up an alert so that every time the user with that email address registered a new domain, it would send me these alerts. And this is just a screenshot of the messages that I get like literally on a daily basis. This same schmo is registering 2 to 5 domains and getting a website up and running with different names, different cities, and fictitious information. And you start to realize when he's working at these levels of volume that he doesn't have the time to actually validate whether Van, West Virginia has a street named Tory Lane. He just doesn't care. And there's also lots of foreign editions. So there's lots of these sites that are in Italian, in French. There are ones that purport to be from various countries in Africa. There's when they're from Northern Africa, they're often in French, which sort of parallels the French history, French colonial history in that part of the world. And there's just tons and tons and tons of these sites. All right. This is the interesting thing. Most of the copy, most of the news stories have been scraped from real places. So you read these stories and you see what's being promoted on social media and you're like, well, okay, so they're not just, dumping a load of BS on us. This is a real story about Brett Kavanaugh. This is a real story about oil price changes. This is a real story about some sports team. It may not be relevant to the local, community, but there's nothing fake about the news. Well, I mean, it is kind of curious that they violate that prime directive, that none of them have that local angle to it. It's clear to me that there's automation at work here that's scraping a whole bunch of different news sites and just dumping this content into some kind of bucket, which then populates out into these things. But every once in a while, there's a story that picks a particular political focus or a particular angle on current events. And they do go out there and promote themselves on social media, or they have networks of people who seem to follow the Catania Daily Top and post a lot of stories about whatever this town is. There's a town called Catania, Tennessee. Again, it's one of these like tiny little, in Europe you'd call it a village, but they're not even that size. And these news sites are just continuing to flourish, and the people who are registering these sites and continuing to produce them and make them live make more and more of them every day. What the hell are they doing? A lot of them are not selling ads, although some are. They've been changing hands periodically. So sometimes they're created by this Nick Dimov guy or some of the other registered users who created some of these ones originally, and then they sell them on to search engine optimization companies and spammers who then continue to operate the site like it's a real site. But then when they've sold them on, the people who buy them from these people throw advertising on them and turn them into an ad revenue generator for themselves, which they then spam out the links on social media. So people click the links, go to the site, the ad pops, and they get paid. but most of them do not have any advertising at all. And this is anathema in journalism. It's impossible. I mean, you've seen, it was 2 talks ago where we saw the slide where Slate was using crypto mining as an alternative, like if you're using an ad blocker. Well, you don't even need to use an ad blocker. I had uBlock Origin running in my browser, and a lot of times you load these pages and it would say 0 out of 100 were blocked because there's no ads on the page. And it's just bizarre. Who is paying for the registrations, who's paying for the hosting, and who is paying for the development of these sites? I have no idea. I wish I did. As I mentioned, some of the speculative reasons is that there's search engine optimization tools, that they may be being used to promote certain things through search engines so that they get ad revenue clicks. Not all the sites are ad free, but there's also the idea that social media manipulation is at play. And in some cases, and especially with the Newburgh Gazette, I have seen social media being used to promote a particular ideology or a particular spin on the news, and it is impossible to avoid. And then there's the sort of third angle here, which is that there's been this philosophy that it seems to be proliferating through the world these days that people are calling the fire hose of bullshit, which is essentially that if you flood the world with so much information and that's misinformation and confusing, that people start to disbelieve in their sources of information. It actually threatens the very fabric of truth and society by providing people an out where they can just say, well, it's just the mainstream media, lamestream media. Why do I care about them? They lie about everything anyway. And that is actually an information warfare technique that was pioneered in the 1960s. And that if you talk to intelligence agency folks, they will tell you that that has been something that certain governments have done for a very long time. And it is not unusual. And they see that and recognize that in its sort of modern digital form. But it's been going on for years. It's just that with the internet and social media, they suddenly have massive reach to spread to lots of places. So, this is the important part. What can we do? Because we're not reporters. We're not editors. We're not publishers of newspapers. Well, with the exception of, you know, and some security companies let us say, you know, and I am grateful for the existence of places like Threat Post that are run by Kaspersky and Naked Security, which is run by my company. And several other security industry companies realized several years ago that if the industry doesn't fund its own journalism, even if it isn't necessarily favorable to the company that is sponsoring it, that it may just go away. That hasn't panned out completely. There's still great outlets like Wired and Ars Technica. But clearly tech journalism has taken a hit like the rest of the industry in the last several years. And they need our help. So these are some of my suggestions of how we can work together to help. If you read tech journalism, and I'm sure most of you do and are sitting here, you know, scrolling through your Twitter feed and reading the latest about the coverage of the supply chain attacks against Supermicro, support those outlets. I actually, I subscribed, Ars Technica did a subscription drive last year for the first time where they asked people to subscribe and they were going to give out a YubiKey. As a gift, and I always wanted a YubiKey, and I support their journalism, so I just signed up and became a member of Ars Technica. Doesn't mean I have to post on their forums and become like an active member of their message board, but my $30 went to that journalism outlet. It means that they can keep doing what they do, which is great journalism and telling the truth. So if you can do that, that's great. If you have the money, drop it. There are tools that journalists use and need to be able to cover the news. A big one is Secure Drop. So this is the tool that was created originally by Aaron Swartz and some other folks, and it's essentially it's a tool that anyone can use. The newspapers will put it on their website and say, if you've got a hot tip on news and you want to safely and anonymously give us information for this tip, it is in theory a highly secure way for sources to reach out to journalistic outlets and send tips. And actually some of the most important scoops that have been covered by the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Guardian and the BBC have all come out of Secure Drop tips. And the problem is that right now, well, I mean, we know poor Aaron is gone and is not with us anymore, but the tool itself is in need of an update and desperately in need of security people to help bring about the next generation of this tool. So if you can donate money, then great. If you can donate your time and your coding expertise, I am not a coder, but if I could, I would, because I can see that SecureDrop is a useful tool for journalists. And they really need our help, because now what's starting to happen, and I've been speaking to some of my friends who are editors at newspapers, is that they are starting to receive weaponized documents coming through SecureDrop. And they don't necessarily, they may have a secure way to receive those documents, but they have no safe way to detonate them in a sandbox and be able to make sure that they're not a malicious doc or a malicious spreadsheet or a malicious PDF or RTF or what have you. So help them out, because the journalists are really hapless in this regard. They're not experts at security, and if they were to get a weaponized document purporting to be some scoop on a giant news story, they are likely to click it. And I mean, it's, you know, we've all seen the reports that come out of places like Citizen Lab, where we know that there are governments and that there are groups that are specifically targeting civil society. And as part of this, journalism is part of civil society. And we need to protect them. We are the only ones who can. And the most important thing is that I've been looking for ways that I can give back to this community, because I was a journalist and I can see the threat that they're under. And what I've been doing is I've been volunteering my time to teach reporters how to not get hacked. And in fact, I'm teaching, so at the University of Colorado, which is in the town where I live, I'm going to be teaching a bunch of classes just for free to students to just drop in at the makerspace called Don't Get Hacked. And it's about how to avoid getting phished and how to avoid getting infected with malware and how most malware comes down the pike into your machine. It's just the basics, because most people don't have this. This is not part of the standard educational curriculum almost anywhere. And if there's a way that you can volunteer your time in your local area, this is an international audience, go back to your communities, reach out to journalists, to schools, to old folks' homes, wherever, go to your public library. They offer classes for free to people who want to just sign up and take classes. Offer a Don't Get Hacked class at the library. It's a great thing to do, and the ripple effects of that kind of volunteer work are incredibly, unbelievably important. We're living in an era where the very nature of truth is at threat. We're all at risk as a result of this, but we have the ability to do something. So lift up your hands and do something. Whatever it is, whatever you can contribute, we need to work together. You can join with me if you want my guidance. I have presentations that I've done. The EFF has created documents and presentations that they've done as guides for people to improve their security. I was talking to a fellow the other day who said that the most popular story on their website is a year-and-a-half-old story about what are the basics of security, and it still gets the most views every single month, and it has for 18 months. The basics is where we need to be. I mean, everyone here is doing amazing research into what's the coolest new thing, but the old stuff is really, really important, because it's those low-hanging fruit that basically catches the most people. So I'll just leave you with this quote. I'm not going to read it. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, big proponents of a free press and understanding the role of a free press and guardians of democracy and guardians of liberty. Please do your part. Please help. That's my plea. Thank you.